Keep Talking exists to have conversations that might help to make a better society and a better culture. As humans, talking openly to each other is one of the key tools we have to gain knowledge, to seek the truth, to foster curiosity, to exchange and explore ideas, to see nuance, to ask big questions, to defend individual liberty, to resist ideology and tribalism, to heal and develop, to glean insight, to learn from history, to change our minds. And in that spirit, I believe that each guest has important information and stories to share. This show is also a deeply personal project for me to learn, to grow, to reduce my own ignorance, to try to make me a better human being and a better citizen. And it's something that I want to share. Ben Westhoff is an investigative journalist and author. In 2019, he published Fentanyl Inc., the definitive story of the fentanyl drug trade and its effects on American culture. During our conversation, Ben talks about his reasons for writing the book, where fentanyl is made and how it enters America, the pervasiveness and dangers of fentanyl to society, and what might be done to add a measure of safety to people at risk from its toxicity. I admire Ben's courage in traveling to China and putting himself at risk to learn truths about the fentanyl drug trade. Fentanyl is amazingly dangerous and is at least 50 times more potent than morphine. It kills tens of thousands of unwitting Americans each year who often buy street drugs they believe to be pure cocaine, MDMA, or opioid pills. This list includes Prince and Tom Petty. Whatever is to be done to improve the situation, it has to start with telling the truth. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Ben Westhoff. All right, Ben. Well, first of all, as I alluded to before we started recording, I've been wanting to talk to you for quite some time. And I just want to start by thanking you again for the time. I know you have a busy schedule, and I really appreciate you coming on and talking to me about your life, your work, your book. It's great to have you on the show.
Nice to meet you, Dan. Thanks for having me.
You got it. I would love to start with a very basic question, which I'm sure you have gotten dozens of times before. And I know that the conversation focus today is going to be on the subject of fentanyl and its effects on the U.S. and U.S. life. To start, I wanted to ask you just a basic question, which is, what is this substance? What is fentanyl? Where does it come from? Any basic overview you could give of that would be, I think, useful as a kicking off point.
Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid, which is 50 times stronger than heroin and was originally created as a medical drug in the 1950s. And it still is widely used in hospitals and for people with cancer and long-term conditions. But it jumped into the recreational realm. And a few years ago, the production techniques started getting a lot more sophisticated. And so it began to be made very cheaply in China on the illicit market. And that sort of flooded the US through the Mexican cartels. And it's so cheap to make, and it's so potent that it's starting to be cut into every, recreational powder that's out there or pressed pill. So you can find it in Coke, meth, black market Xanax pills, OxyContin, it's in addition to heroin, where it's traditionally been found the most. And so only 2 grains of rice worth will kill you. And so people who don't even realize they're taking any fentanyl are overdosing, dying from it.
Yeah. I mentioned this to you before we started recording as well, that I think many Americans my age have a direct connection to the effect that substance is having on our culture, with a family friend who died a couple years ago in my case. I'm curious for you how you got interested in this in the first place. Was it something personal as well, or were you just curious about the substance?
Yeah, I did have a friend who died in St. Louis from a fentanyl overdose. He had been drinking as well, and he kind of suffocated in his pillow. And these were the patches that he had procured on the black market. And his name was Michael Schaefer-Meyer. He was a good friend of mine, and that was 2010 actually. And
wow.
Nobody really knew much about it then. And I got more into it when I was thinking of writing a book about ecstasy. but then I realized there was almost no ecstasy out there on the market, and all of it, what was being sold as ecstasy or Molly, was actually these new adulterated drugs, and they were adulterated with chemicals that no one had ever heard of. And so I kind of went down the rabbit hole and learned about this class of new chemicals called novel psychoactive substances, or NPS. And fentanyl is the most dangerous of those, and they're all made in China and sold on the dark web, and as well as on the clear web. And so my book is kind of about my attempts to get to the bottom of what started this national nightmare of drug overdose deaths and what we might do about it.
And where I think one of the most interesting facts or aspects to my learning from you and researching you about what you learned is the role of China in the distribution of fentanyl in American society. And I would love for you to speak to, an audience of people that hypothetically are quite uninformed about the role of that nation in getting fentanyl in, so maybe specifically related to the percentage of the fentanyl in the world that's made in China, how it gets here, and your general thoughts on the intention behind China, as I understand it, kind of getting the fentanyl into the U.S. via Mexico as potentially an intentional act to do damage on the American populace.
Well, the majority of the illicit fentanyl is made in China. There's also, lots of legitimate fentanyl that's made for hospitals, and as we discussed, and those are made in Europe primarily, some in the U.S. But the illicit fentanyl is almost all made in China, and it's made in China for the same reason that all, like cheap products so many cheap products that we buy are made in China, because they do it very efficiently and for a low cost. And there's a huge chemical industry in China, the biggest chemical and pharmaceutical industries in the world. And the vast majority of it is legitimate, but a certain percentage is dedicated to this, you wouldn't say black market exactly, because a lot of it is actually legal in China. And so until fairly recently, these different types of fentanyl, called fentanyl analogs, were totally legal for export in China. And so China banned fentanyl itself many years ago. But to get around that law, all the chemists had to do was tweak the molecule a slight bit. And they had these new fentanyl analogs. And the most well-known of them is called carfentanil, which is actually like an elephant tranquilizer. And so in this gray market for these chemicals that were legal in China but illegal in the US, they were popularized over the internet, and they could be and can be acquired in two different ways. One is directly over the internet, by the individual consumer, and people can have drugs sent right to their front door, or else the traditional route is through the Mexican cartels. And so the cartels order vast amounts of these fentanyl analogs, or the fentanyl ingredients even, and they're delivered on big cargo ships, and they're packaged by the cartels and then sent up through the southern border. And that's the same way that drugs like coke and meth and heroin and even some marijuana is distributed in the US. And so as for, China's intentions, I mean, this started out very much as, I think, kind of capitalism gone crazy. It was just the Chinese government, as I discovered for my book, was actually incentivizing the export of these fentanyl analogs, because by giving what's called a value-added tax rebate.
Yeah.
And so companies that exported fentanyl would get this huge tax rebate. And the reason for that was China was trying to promote its chemical industry internationally. So it wasn't just fentanyl, it was this whole long list of chemicals that got these rebates. because China wanted to go from, they're mainly producing generic drugs, and they wanted to start producing these more expensive name brand drugs, and they were trying to encourage that. And so that's why fentanyl was incentivized in that way. But now that the fentanyl crisis in the U.S. is very well known, it's China has taken some steps to combat the problem. Like I said, they did a blanket ban of all types of fentanyl a couple of years ago, and they've pledged, they've worked with U.S. law enforcement to some extent, but they haven't really cracked down on fentanyl the way they have on drugs that are affecting the Chinese population. For example, meth and heroin are big problems in China, and the government works really hard to try to stamp those out. But fentanyl is not a problem in China at all. Like, most people have not even heard of it, even though it's made there. And so China hasn't devoted the same amount of resources. So, I'm not really a conspiracy theorist. I don't think this is some sort of like covert form of warfare necessarily, but I do think that China just is not, that if it was their own population, they would be working a lot harder to try to stop this problem.
Yeah. And just to clarify the point you just made, it sounds like fentanyl as an export is technically illegal for export from China, but the ingredients to make it are not necessarily so. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's the biggest problem right now. They're called precursors. Yeah. And the main business that these Chinese companies do with the Mexican cartels is they send over these boatloads of the precursor chemicals. And once the cartels get them, it's a very easy chemical process to make finished fentanyl. And so that's really driving the epidemic right now.
Yeah. Where are we currently in terms of the death rates or the effects of fentanyl on U.S. kids, the U.S. population in general? Have any of these measures, the working with the Chinese government, with the United States, helped to curb the overdose problem, or is it still as bad as it ever was?
Well, it's worse than it ever was. It's the problem that just keeps on getting worse, and COVID has definitely exacerbated the situation. There was something like 93,000 drug overdose deaths in the U.S. Last year, and that's a new record by far. And fentanyl is responsible for the majority of them. And so it's the third wave of the opioid epidemic. So the first wave began in the 90s with the overprescription of OxyContin and those type of pain relievers, and then the second wave was heroin. And but now it's very hard to find any heroin on the streets that isn't cut with fentanyl, and that represents the third wave of the opioid epidemic.
Yeah, and to that point, and this I think dovetails into my own personal anecdote and experience with a family friend that died from this, and you obviously can speak to this in far more detail, but the unpredictability and the uncertainty of whether drugs that are being bought on the street actually have this cut within it. I've heard you say in the past that, a couple famous people, for example, who died, who OD'd, Tom Petty being one, Prince being the other, actually, it was certainly not an intentional act, that it was it was a surprise to them. It was the purchasing a substance that they didn't quite understand what was within it that really took them out.
Yeah, and that's very, very common. There have been some famous rappers too, Lil Peep, Juice WRLD, Mac Miller. All of these people didn't plan to take fentanyl. Fentanyl was just cut into the other drugs they were taking. And what I tell young people in particular is that any powder or any pill that you get off the black market could have fentanyl. It's if someone hands you a pill at the party and they're, you're like, well, it looks exactly like a Xanax bar, it's a pharmaceutical, it's got to be safe. The fact is that there are people pressing these up on pill pressing machines, making them with fentanyl, and they're pressed to look exactly like the real pill. And so you just can't trust anything on the black market almost at all.
Do you attribute that fact to the surge in the overdose deaths, at least in part, right? I think you said 93,000 people during 2020, I assume, died of an overdose. It seems to me that maybe it's a combination of not knowing what you're taking, the circumstances of COVID and the lifestyle due to COVID, and increases, I would imagine, in mental health issues and depression. Would love for you to speak to that in general.
Well, yeah, I mean, COVID, I think exacerbated the problem. You know, people like were out of work and struggling financially, and depression and these things tend towards drug use. But, you know, it was already on the rise even well before COVID. And that has to do with fentanyl just increasingly saturating the market. So at first it was mainly in heroin, but not a lot of people use heroin. Do you know what I mean? Cocaine and meth are much more popular drugs. And so it's really gotten in those supplies. But now it's starting to get into the pill supply, and pills are by far the most abused drug. And so, you know, there's tons of people who would never shoot up heroin, but they'll pop a pill. And since it's gotten into that supply, it's really ratcheted up the death toll. And unfortunately, that seems like it's only going to get worse, because there are still a lot of parts of the country, like West Virginia, for example, I think maybe the Appalachia area, people have been abusing pills for a long time, and it's only now starting to get into the pill supply, and it's only probably going to get worse.
What do we know, if anything, about the percentage of these street drugs, right? The cocaines, the pills, the heroin that have fentanyl within it. Is it, a rough range of percentages of, if you're, taking one of those substances, that we know, generally speaking, what the probability is that it might be laced with fentanyl?
I don't have good numbers about that, but I mean, I think just from a user perspective, just assume that it does have it. And there's really great testing kits out there. I always recommend a company called the Bunk Police, and they have fentanyl testing strips. You can get them a lot of places off the internet and elsewhere, and they're really cheap and easy. It's just, you just dip them into a solution of the drugs, and it will tell you, like a pregnancy test, immediately if it has fentanyl in it or not.
And I guess this transitions into another question, which is, what are the recommendations you give to people that I don't know that we're ever going to live in a culture where people aren't going to want to do drugs or try different experimentations when they're out and it becomes available. Obviously, I would imagine that testing kit is something that you would recommend if you are going to try substances. But what else do you say to people, to as suggestions to try to help them or to mitigate some of the risk?
Well, first of all, if you're getting your pills directly from a pharmacy or from your doctor or whatever, those are going to be okay. I'm speaking specifically about anything obtained on the black market. Secondly, if you've got marijuana flower, and you've bought it at a dispensary, or even if you can smell the buds, if they look like real buds, smell like real buds, you're going to be fine. There's been almost no instances of fentanyl adulterating, marijuana flower, because there's not really a financial incentive to do it. And plus, you would be able to tell, it wouldn't look right. When it comes to drug use, yeah, people are always going to use drugs. There's no stopping them. I would just urge people to think ahead. You know what I mean? Like, to plan your drug use. Like, if you plan your drug use, you'll be able to use a testing kit to find out if what you have is the real thing. There's, like I said, increasingly sophisticated kits that can test to see if your ecstasy has real MDMA, your Molly, your LSD is real, everything. And the problem is when people are just out at parties and someone else is doing something and they just jump in. I mean, if if you see someone like doing rails, and they've been doing them all night and they're still standing, maybe it's maybe you probably will be all right. But drugs can also affect people differently, and so yeah, it's those type of situations that are really taking people by surprise and killing young people especially.
Yeah. Do we know if the fentanyl-laced drugs are more common in certain regions of the country, the ones that are closer to the Mexican border, for example, or is it widely
No,
distributed
it
everywhere?
it really started in the Northeast, and now it's like swept across the country. It's really strong in the West Coast now, but yeah, I mean it's getting everywhere. It's only in the U.S. and Canada right now for the most part, but I think it's really only a matter of time before Europe and other parts of the world are really saturated with it too. It's just like the Taliban just like banned opium poppy planting, I think, when they came back. I don't know if I have those details right exactly, but there's been a disruption in the heroin from Afghanistan. So it seems very likely to me that fentanyl is going to the market incentive for it is just too strong to
Yeah.
come into these other countries as well.
In my experience, this is again anecdotal of living in this country. I have lived through the waves you were mentioning of the drug issues that we've experienced, and I remember the second wave. I think you articulated where there was a serious heroin problem, and I had people I knew who I went to high school with in northwestern Pennsylvania who died, who would be found in bathroom stalls, overdosing on heroin. I get the sense, just personally, that fentanyl is less widely known about and understood in the culture at large, and I would be interested in getting your thoughts as to whether this is getting the attention and whether the facts related to fentanyl are yet widespread enough in the culture to really understand what's going on.
No, I don't think it is widely known. I think the COVID epidemic really sucked up a lot of the media oxygen. And I think people also just have opioid fatigue,
Yeah.
like we've been hearing about the opioid crisis for a couple decades or more now. And so people, when they hear like there's this new part of it, it's like they've been hearing about it for so long, they don't even want to pay attention. And part of it is that people, there's still a lot of stigma, and people think of themselves like people who use opioids. They're not like I am. These are drug users. This is a different kind of person.
Yeah.
But I think increasingly, though, that's starting to change because, so like you were mentioning, so many people know someone who's really been touched by this epidemic that it's getting less like a division between them and us.
Yeah. I have heard you say in prior interviews that, and I don't know if this is still the case, but at one point a couple of years ago, I think you said that something like 90% of the world's fentanyl was coming out of China, or at least the ingredients to make fentanyl were coming out of China. But you also alluded to the fact that, I think this was in the spirit of the larger point, that drugs sort of always find a way because the demand is there, and that if we were successful in blocking China from getting the ingredients to make fentanyl into the U.S., that your thought was that India potentially would take over as a potential leader there. I heard about this in
India
interviews.
already is. Yeah, India is already making increasing amounts of fentanyl, and their laws are even less prohibitive. China has worked with the U.S. government to some extent, but India really hasn't. So it's possible that even if we did shut down China in this regard, the problem would get even worse.
In terms of the percentages, is it still roughly that 90% or so of the world's fentanyl comes out of China, or
Maybe,
has that dropped?
it's very, very hard to know, but that seems approximately accurate.
It's the vast majority.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have heard you speak as well in terms of the story of you writing the book and the investigations that you did going over to China and investigating the labs. posing as a drug dealer to go over there to get some of your research. For somebody who's listening to this who is interested in journalism and the art and the craft of the work that you do, I would love for you to kind of just tell the story of how you began to do your own, what sounds like kind of individual research that led to you going over there and meeting what sound like family men drug dealers who eventually trusted you enough to let you into some of their facilities. How does that work? What begins the outreach for you to be able to connect with these people to begin to do firsthand research like that?
Well, I started off just Googling buy fentanyl in China, and all these sales people had their email addresses and phone numbers, Skype contact information right there on the internet. And so I made some fake contact information, and I reached out to them, and we struck up a rapport. And I talked to some of these fentanyl salespeople for weeks and weeks and months. And finally I asked some if they would show me the lab if I came there. And so I went over there. I didn't get a journalist visa. I just used a regular tourist visa. And so I was like partly afraid that these drug dealers, these drug manufacturers would find out who I was, but I was partly afraid the government would realize I was doing journalism without the proper visa. And, but I went to Wuhan, and this is before coronavirus, and Shanghai. And in Wuhan, I visited this company that makes the more fentanyl precursors than any other company. They're called Yuan Cheng. And I wrote about this experience for the Atlantic. But basically, yeah, they say they sell over 10,000 chemicals, but really they focus on these fentanyl ingredients and steroids. And I went in there and I pretended that I was interested in buying this stuff. And they gave me a tour of the whole company. These like young, perky sales people showed me, what their whole work. And I was shocked that it was like, basically, it looked like a Western company. These are people, recent college graduates at cubicles with like desktop computers, and it was almost like the Google campus in a way, kind of a lower rent version of that. And then in Shanghai, I visited an actual lab, like a Breaking Bad style lab, where this chemist owned a small company with maybe like 5 employees, and they were making all sorts of fentanyl analogs and also synthetic cannabinoids like K2 and spice. And I was really shocked by the scope of the lab, the quantity of the chemicals they were making, considering just a tiny little bit is enough to make you overdose and die. And they had, like piles and piles of these chemicals on these lab tables, and in little 1 kilo bags, like barrels and barrels of them. And it was very hair raising. Is that the term?
Yeah.
It was very scary, because I got in the car with this lab owner and his driver, who was maybe his personal security also, and went out to the distant suburbs of Shanghai to see the lab, and kind of telling all these lies about where I was from and what my purpose was. And we got to the lab. It was in this kind of suburban office park that really looked like completely innocuous from the outside. And I had my voice recorder going in my jacket pocket. And so I just sort of described what I saw out loud to use for my reporting later. And I got out of there, by the skin of my teeth.
What makes you risk your own physical safety like that? I mean, is it the personal experience and wanting to get to the bottom of what had happened to somebody you knew? Is it just sort of an ethos of somebody who tries to take journalism seriously? Like, what mentality you're married, you have a nice life in the U.S. What drove you to want to do something like that, where you're actually putting yourself in some pretty serious harm's way?
Well, probably just being a moron, you know, not not thinking clearly. But I mean, I don't know. I do take journalism very seriously, and the fact that this is an epidemic that is touching so many people and it had never been reported on. I kept reading about all of this industry taking place in China, but no one had ever went to one of these labs. And so I felt like I could really learn a lot and share information and help like shed light on this process. And the other thing that made me feel a little safer was that it wasn't like the Mexican cartels where they're beheading people and they have AK-47s, and stuff like that. I mean, these Chinese chemists are like trying to make money, really, and they don't want to make a stink. They just sort of want to like operate in peace. And so I was betting that doing something to me might be bad for their business.
Yeah. I know you've done a lot of interviews related to this book since its publication, and I would love to, I guess, ask a kind of open-ended question to you, which is, what are the questions or a question that you don't get asked enough that you think you should be asked to really get at a core truth or a core insight that you glean from your research on the book? And you don't even have to formulate the question, but just a subject matter that really speaks to you, that is you think profound and important, that you uncovered when you were doing your research.
Well, yeah, I mean, the journalism aspect, like I said, is really important to me. And I think like journalism isn't as hard as people think it is. It's basically, you're just putting in the time and putting in the effort to try to uncover stuff that hasn't been reported on before. And the vast majority of things have never been reported.
Yeah.
It's not very difficult to just by talking to people. I think a lot of people who want to be reporters spend all their days on the internet, but like the stuff, by virtue of being on the internet, it usually has been reported. And so if you're, making phone calls, meeting up with people, seeing new things, that's sort of the way to do this. And I think sort of trying to go against the conventional wisdom is also important too. Right now I'm looking into these different opioid treatments, and it seems to me that one of them in particular, called naltrexone, has been sort of unfairly maligned. It's an opioid blocker, and currently in vogue are these called opioid agonists that are part of medication-assisted treatment, and those are methadone and buprenorphine. And these are opioids themselves, and they help people taper off bad opioids like fentanyl and heroin. And these have, people have had, like, a lot of people have had success with them, but this blocker called naltrexone, I think there's a ton of potential for that, because once you take it, you could take as much heroin or fentanyl as you wanted, and it wouldn't make you high, you wouldn't overdose. It's kind of this miracle drug that I don't think is being utilized enough. And so I think that's another big part of journalism, is sort of listening to your own instincts. And, when you think something doesn't sound right, kind of pushing a little further and trying to get to the bottom of it.
Yeah. I know you've probably thought quite deeply about these subjects just from a cultural level. Like, where do you think we as Americans go from here, or should go from here, as a people and from a policy perspective? This is clearly a plague on our country, and I mean, you're talking about 90,000 people last year who died from this. That's a big number. What in your estimation are some steps that might be useful to try to begin to improve the situation?
I am a proponent of harm reduction, which is the idea, like we talked about, that people are always going to use drugs, and we just need to find a way to make it safer, to educate people better, to help them recover. I'm not a proponent of locking people up for nonviolent drug offenses, and it seems like the country is moving in that direction. But to I get asked a lot about legalization and the things like that, and I'm certainly in favor of decriminalizing most drugs, if not all of them. But to me, legalization implies that they're available more easily. Like with the legalization of marijuana, for example, we're seeing these storefronts pop up in these states where it's legal, and sometimes it's like leading to higher rates of consumption. And there's this sort of mentality that marijuana is a health food, but really it's not good for you either. And so while I think it's better, it's a safer drug than alcohol. But then there are drugs like psychedelics, and I think people can really benefit from them, especially in a medical realm, and even people who are using them recreationally. And so that's not those shouldn't necessarily be regulated the same way that something like heroin should be. And then there are even different classes of psychedelics, like DMT is, that's like super potent, and that shouldn't necessarily be classified the same way as magic mushrooms, for example. So it's really a lot to sort out. And I have spent a lot of time thinking about this, but my thinking on a lot of these issues is still evolving as well.
Is there a city, a state, a country that in your mind, given the complexity of all this, that is handling how to deal with these substances in a way that you find to be most rational or the best option that you're familiar with?
A lot of people point to Spain and Portugal, and I agree. They decriminalized drugs, and Portugal in particular had a really big heroin problem, and that has been reduced. Spain has a lot of great harm reduction programs, like I talk about in the book, and they don't have fentanyl, and that might be owing to other factors. But the people on the ground who I talked to in Spain say that since the traditional drugs are legal, most people prefer the traditional drugs. So heroin, marijuana, psychedelic, like traditional psychedelics like LSD, rather than all these kind of like newfangled, nefarious psychedelics and NPS. All these hundreds and hundreds of new drugs that are basically copies, knockoffs of the original drugs, but they're much more potent. So, fake LSD, fake marijuana, fake heroin, all of these drugs are much worse. And Spain and Portugal don't have a big problem with these drugs. And so it seems to me that they are perhaps doing something right. But then again, there's all these kind of like socio-economic, political factors that play in that make it very hard to compare one country to another.
Yeah. And I know the book has been out now for a few years, and I would be curious to know if you have changed your mind on anything, or at least evolved in any way in terms of what your general conclusions were, or primary beliefs that really carried the weight of the book that have been altered in the years since its publication.
Yeah, well, some of these things I'm talking about right now are the book came out in September 2019, and some of the things that I've been mentioning now are probably not exactly what I said in the book. I think the question of legalization is kind of going to be the biggest question of our time in the U.S. But also how we're treating people with opioid use disorder. People who are addicted to opioids. That's, to me, kind of setting up as this big battleground, because there's kind of this abstinence movement versus this like using lower level opioids to taper off. And they each proponent of each side really has strong arguments. And the same in the world of alcoholism. There's this kind of the 12-step mentality is kind of in vogue for a lot of places, and that's the abstinence model. But this drug I was talking about, naltrexone, can actually treat alcoholism too. And so it remains to be seen where we're gonna settle, but it could have really big ramifications.
Yeah. I know our time is coming to a close relatively quickly here, and I want to just kind of nail down a few more of the facts and bits of information that you detail in the book. One of the aspects that I would be curious to get you to speak about are related to the legal ways in which fentanyl is actually used in a medical context, right? It has some purpose in a legal setting. I think I've heard you say in the past that women who are going into childbirth, that's a context in which it is being used medically. Another is with open heart surgery.
Epidural. Yeah,
for
epidurals.
epidurals. Yeah. So, speak to that a little bit, that like the legal methods in which fentanyl is being used that make it have a proper place in our culture in a medical context.
Yeah, I don't think it's a particularly controversial drug in the medical field. It was originally developed as kind of a replacement for morphine, in that it came on faster and caused less nausea. And so it kind of enabled open heart surgery to be done, more effectively. And today, for a lot of kind of like end of life patients, and people with cancer, it's a very effective drug for sort of like chronic pain. It's kind of the next level up from something like OxyContin. And when men go for colonoscopies, they're given fentanyl often, and it sort of puts them out. So it's measured, the dosage is measured by an anesthesiologist, someone who's trained to do it. And it certainly there have been a lot of reports of anesthesiologists themselves and nurses and doctors getting hooked and kind of stealing it from the hospital and replacing it with water in some cases. But for the most part, it's measured properly, and it's used for its intended use. It's not really a take-home drug for people, otherwise healthy people, the way that the OxyContin pills were. So there have been reports of fentanyl being misappropriated from hospitals and sold in black markets, but that's not really the main source of fentanyl you find on the street either. So it's almost like it's two separate, like, shadow industries of fentanyl, the illicit one and the legal one, and they like overlap very little.
Yeah. The experience of the person who is taking it, right? I mean, I've heard you speak to this as well in the past, that as is true with many drugs, it's often very enjoyable, inducing some form of euphoria. I would love to get your just general take on what that experience tends to be like for people who are on these substances.
I have never taken fentanyl, but I've taken other opioids, and yeah, it's people describe it as kind of like floating on a cloud, and it's just sort of takes away all your concerns at the moment, and it's a narcotic. It puts you into a sort of a stupor if you take too much, and it gives people the nod and makes them kind of drift in and out of sleep. I've heard fentanyl described as kind of less soulful than heroin. Heroin, it lasts longer. Fentanyl, though, wears off more quickly, and you need to re-up so often. And that's another problem with it, is that people find themselves going into withdrawal even more quickly. So it's It's like any opioid. It can cause the greatest pleasure humans can know practically, and it can also cause the greatest suffering.
Yeah. There are two final things I want to go over before we wrap this up. One is a point we've already touched on, but I want to underline it again for people who I think we both agree may not know that this is even a thing in the U.S., and that is related to the inability without a testing kit to really know whether a drug you might be taking actually contains fentanyl in it, and by ingesting that substance, you're really risking your life. What are the substances, again, just to clarify this one more time, that kids, people in our culture really should be looking out for as being at potential risk for having fentanyl in it?
Just any pill or any powder that you buy in the black market. So, that just means any drug dealer, any of your friends at a party, anything, fentanyl tends to be like a white powder. And so it can be very easily mixed into cocaine or meth or heroin, and it can be very easily pressed up into pills. So, yeah, it's very, very common.
And given that fact, it sounds like, is it correct to assume that people who are doing, mushrooms, you already talked about marijuana earlier, that those substances are much less likely to be laced with fentanyl, given the way that fentanyl seems to be wedded into these other substances?
Well, yeah, I haven't heard about cases where people had fentanyl on their magic mushrooms. I mean, you think about the incentive structure for a drug dealer, right? So to cut cocaine, to make it step on it, to increase the volume, that makes sense, right? For these other drugs, it makes sense. But like sprinkling fentanyl on some magic mushrooms, I mean, that's not going to make the drug. That's not going to make it more profitable.
Yeah.
For a drug dealer, and so I don't see that really happening as much. And again, if you see the mushrooms, if they look like mushrooms, if they, you're going to be able to tell if something is off with something like magic mushrooms, with these organic plant matter drugs. I guess they don't have to be organic, but with these drugs that are plants. When it comes to these other pills and powders, though, it's much more difficult to tell if they've been adulterated.
Yeah. The last question I want to ask you is related to our culture and our society, and that's really what this show is about. Its focuses on culture and society, and I'm wondering, for you, given your research in this book, given your curiosity about the culture in general, what's next? What are you interested in? What do you think people are not talking about that they really should be?
Well, yeah. I mean, my next book, it's coming out in May, and it's about the murder of my mentee in the Big Brothers Big Sisters program. His name was Jorel Cleveland, and he was 19. We had been together for 11 years. I was his, big brother in the program, and he was killed in near his home in Ferguson, Missouri, which is outside of St. Louis, where I live. And so that case was unsolved for a number of years. But for this book, I, figured out who killed him, and it was this big sort of investigation. And it's also about St. Louis and sort of this the rising rates of the murder rates are rising around the country. There's sort of this chronic poverty in not just cities, but now in suburbs like Ferguson, and sort of dovetailing with the Michael Brown protests and the George Floyd protests around the country, and how this all affected Jorel's world where he grew up. So that's coming out in May. It's called Little Brother.
Yeah. I was in the Big Brother Big Sister program too in San Francisco.
That's great.
Yeah, for a few years, and man, I'm sorry to hear about that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think it's a great program, and I highly recommend it. It's really sad that Jarrell was killed, but the experience of being with him all those years really opened my eyes, and I learned so much, and I'm so glad to have known him.
Yeah. Well, Ben, before we sign off, I just want to thank you on behalf of a lot of people that know your work and are familiar with your writing. I didn't know anything about fentanyl really until I was exposed to what you do. I really admire the interest and the guts and the time that it took to put this book together and to share it with people. So thank you for the time today, and also thank you for the effort that it took to create information that I think is really useful and important for people in the U.S. and around the world really to know about. It was really great to meet you, and I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Great. Well, thank you, Dan. I appreciate your having me and all the good questions.
Yeah. Thanks, man. Good luck with everything.
All right. Take care. You too.
All right. Take care, man. Thank you for listening to this episode of Keep Talking. If you are finding value in this podcast, please consider supporting the show on Patreon at patreon.com/keeptalkingpodcast. I truly appreciate all of you who are supporting the show.